Everyone, thanks for joining. I'm super excited about tonight's guest. He is a history professor that is super knowledgeable about all kinds of visitors to New England. So hang tight, and I'll be right back with Eddie Guimont. Hi, Eddie. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Yeah, a quick shout out to our mutual friend Horace Smith for introducing us. You touched a few things in our email exchanges that really piqued my interest. So I'm very excited to pick your brain about some things today.
Oh, it's here to be picked, so happy to provide it.
And you're joining us from Pukwudgie territory
I
also.
am. I'm in Fall River, Massachusetts, which I guess it's technically, I think, directly below the lower tip of the so-called Bridgewater Triangle. Freetown, the town that's right north of us, is that southern tip. But got the state forest where a lot of the Pukwudgie sightings are. It is officially the Fall River Freetown State Forest. So I feel like I'm able to still say I'm in the Bridgewater Triangle, even if just at that lower edge.
I think it's more like the Bridgewater blob, personally. And I don't think that like Pukwudgies would adhere to any type of border or boundary.
Yeah,
I don't think they'd be into that. Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, so the Freetown State Forest is actually the one place I do not like. Um, I am not, like a paranormal sensitive person at all, but that place, I just don't like it. It makes me
It's
angry.
I mean, it's funny, I knew about its reputation before I moved here a few years ago, and when I did move here, one of the first things I did was, I'll go walk around the state forest, to have a good time there, and it was still in winter, so there's a lot of snow, and I'm walking around just thinking like, it's not too spooky, and then the sun was started to go down. Then I realized like there's no signs, and so I was getting a little lost walking around. So when all of a sudden it's cold, it's getting dark, you're lost. So I could see the kind of the ominous aspect of the forest, and maybe during the day it's not so evident.
Yeah, and then I've also stayed at the Lizzie Borden house. Fine there, nothing. Perfectly
Well,
fine.
I think my understanding, and I know this just from hearsay around town. Like I'll say, the current owners of the Lizzie Borden house they're not too popular around here. There's been a big dispute with them and a coffee shop that's nearby, and I
I
think it's
heard
called
about that.
Miss.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the coffee shop owners are very nice, and I think the Lizzie Borden house owners did not do themselves any, and they've kind of been doubling down on it too. It's been so they've kind of made a bad name for themselves in town. But my understanding is that a lot of the so-called haunted reputation of the Lizzie Borden house kind of was PR for them after they started promoting it as the big bed and breakfast. I don't believe there was a huge history of kind of paranormal sightings there. And it's also worth noting it's not the house that she died in either. It's across town, the Maplecroft house, which is still a private residence. And it's funny, that house was up for sale a few years ago, and I'd go running past it in the morning, and no sign, nothing that indicates that this is the Lizzie Borden like residence at all, but a lot of signs, like private property, under surveillance, do not approach. So I imagine they must have, or at least in the past, have had some issue, people, kind of trying to show up and peep in the windows or something.
Actually, not too long ago, I noticed that the Fall River Historical Society's website, they have a picture of her holding, it was either she was holding a dog, but the caption said with her cat or vice versa. Love
Interesting. Yeah,
that.
it's I've noticed a few issues with the Fall River Historical Society website. Now, I've only actually been to the location once. Maybe they're done now, but for a while they were renovating, so I wasn't able to go in person. But yeah, I asked them about something on the website when I went there, and no one knew anything about it. So I think maybe there's a bit of a disconnect between the website and the volunteers who actually work at the place, which I guess is on. I've volunteered at historical societies before, so I can understand that. But yeah, it is something I've run into also.
Yeah. Have you noticed a lot of difference in different towns' historical societies and the way they operate? Because from my perspective, I grew up in Lebanon, Connecticut, where everything's historical.
Hmm.
The historical society kind of runs the town, and they like to gloss over any kind of ugly aspects. But I just went to Old Newgate Prison
Hmm.
that's under the state, and they are very straightforward in giving you the real history of the place. So have you found that, some towns do a better job than others with that type of thing?
Yeah, I've noticed. I used when I was in college. I worked at the Glastonbury Glastonbury, Connecticut, I should say. I also worked for the Connecticut Historical Society for a brief amount of time, and the old State House in Hartford. So those are kind of the three direct bits of historical society experience I have. But just going to local towns, it really varies. There's certain towns where they have something notorious, like the Fall River Historical Society, as you can imagine. A lot of it's dedicated to Lizzie Borden. If you go into uh, the gift shop, a lot of Lizzie Borden history books there, and they have a big sign. We're not endorsing any particular verdict or theory. They're very clear about that. But, you go to some like say like middle of nowhere town in Vermont or upstate New York, and it's like here's the history of this one farm, or here's the church. So, I mean, I think it varies. I mean, I will say I've noticed that in Connecticut, at least, the State Historical Society in Hartford, even in Glastonbury too. They've done a big effort of bringing, I guess, marginalized peoples, not shying away from negative experience. Like I know, at least I think since I've really worked there, which was some time ago, I think they've really tried to do a lot more of Native American stuff at the Glastonbury Historical Society, which was definitely a large blank, or not. They did have a small amount, but it wasn't as prominent as the last time I was there a few years ago.
Yeah, like we growing up as kids, I didn't even think that there were slaves in the North.
Yeah.
And then you find out there definitely was, for sure.
Yeah.
And the ancient burial grounds in Hartford, they have been doing a great job of talking about the history of slavery as well as the Connecticut witch trials and all of
I was
that.
going to say maybe 5 years. I guess this would have been right before the pandemic in 2019. I went on one of the guided tours of the ancient burial ground, and a lot of detail on the Connecticut witch trials. And my understanding is that a lot of the actual or suspected witch graves are now kind of underneath the street, in front of was it the Travelers Tower there? So I think certainly they're not marked in any way, but they've done a good job, at least in the tours, of bringing that up. And I think the Connecticut trials in particular have kind of gotten a bit more of a resonance in the last few years. There's been the efforts to pardon or to secure pardons for the people executed during the trials, which also has been, my understanding, fairly difficult, just because it's a lot of international law. If I'm remembering correct, this might be either some of the Massachusetts ones or Connecticut ones. They ended up having to basically lobby the British government because,
Yep.
as colonies at the time, they essentially had to get part. They're certainly not under U.S. jurisdiction. So modern laws, even the modern state constitutions aren't in effect. There aren't they're colonies, not states. But yeah, so it is interesting exactly who you would have to approach to get a pardon. Overall. And there's been something similar too with I'm sure you're familiar with the New England vampire panic, and some of the vampire graves that have been accidentally unearthed, and the need to reinter them. And I think my understanding is this is not just the vampire graves, although that's how I came across this. But anytime there's a colonial era grave that a construction site accidentally unearths, you have to reinter them by uh, the religious understandings of the time. But because of the separation of church and state. The state government can't really intrude in this. There's a lot of kind of informal back and forth of the state hiring like congregationalist ministers as advisors to conduct the burial rites, and it is an interesting morass when you get into some of these issues of modern governments, modern historical institutions trying to determine how best to deal with historical injustices when they're very directly being applied to modern law, modern government.
Yeah. Now, the Glastonbury Historical Society had an exhibit about a local cryptid, correct?
They did, yes. I believe it's no longer there, but at least as of I think mid-late 2022, it was. They told me it was being taken down, but it might still be there if anyone's curious. But yeah, this is the Gloacus, which is definitely a very interesting case. One of the, well, I guess not the only, but one of the few kind of so-called homegrown Connecticut cryptids, certainly. I'm curious, so as someone who's interested in this, what was your knowledge, or what have you heard about the Gloacus?
So no one ever talks about it. I only came across it a few years ago, and I read a few articles with a few accounts, and I kind of wrote it off as these people just didn't know what a Fisher cat was. Just from the the physical description and the terrible screaming noises they said it was making. I remember the first time I saw a Fisher cat, and it sounds like a demon. And they are kind of, if I didn't have the internet to look up what I had seen, I don't know what I would have thought, but
Well,
that was,
yeah,
how I assessed it.
yeah. I remember the first time I heard a red fox screaming at night. I mean, if you didn't know what it was, you would think someone was being murdered in the woods, but yeah. I mean, so for listeners who aren't aware, which I imagine probably even most listeners from Connecticut, yeah, it's in 1939 in Glastonbury, Connecticut, and people who might be aware of Glastonbury today, very say an upscale, suburb of Hartford across the Connecticut River. But in the 1930s, this was a very poor agricultural neighborhood or town, a very small population, even compared to today. To the extent that most of the bridges in town, even today, are left over from the New Deal. They had to have, the federal government come in and build, even just like basic roads at the time. So this is, a very poor farming community at the height of the Great Depression. This is coming right after, the huge destructive hurricane of 1938, which really damaged a lot of towns along the Connecticut River. I believe my understanding is this is also a very harsh winter as well. But in the middle of the night, farmers are listening. They're hearing this, screaming animal, screaming something. They find these, paw prints in the snow in the morning. Pet dogs, cattle, livestock have been killed by this creature. They see glimpses of what seems to be some kind of giant black cat or cat-like creature, and this becomes known as the Gloacus, or it's eventually termed that kind of affectionately. It's an abbreviation of the Glastonbury Wackius, and so you have something which initially, for farmers, especially in the Great Depression, something that's killing your livestock is going to, that's a major threat to your livelihood. Not to mention it's, dangerous. If it kills livestock, it can kill you. This quickly became, kind of like it quickly got defanged, so to speak. The Hartford Courant, the Hartford Times, which is no longer around, but was the other rival newspaper. Actually, the Hartford Times building is now the UConn Hartford campus downtown. But the two newspapers first, and then the New York Times, the national newspaper, are publishing stories about the Gloacus. There are people across Connecticut coming to Glastonbury to hunt this. People are putting up bounties, but it quickly becomes kind of a like a publicity thing. Local farmers in Glastonbury, they're like charging, parking for Gloacus hunters. They're selling food to the people coming in for the day. Selling ammo. In Hartford, several insurance companies, and again, Hartford, insurance capital of the world, they're offering to sell Gloacus insurance. there are people, like offering, like bounties. Butchers in Hartford are offering bounties for Gloacus meat. Uh, uh, Clothing or clothiers are offering, uh, bounties for the Gloacus pelts, to make, like a Gloacus pelt, shirt or something. So this becomes, a major thing for a few weeks, a few months. It does, eventually die out, but there are this, a few occasional waves over the next few decades. I think the 1950s, there's a brief wave, and then the 1960s, there's also like another brief wave of sightings, notably not in Glastonbury, but elsewhere in Connecticut. But my understanding, at least, is that after the 1960s, it kind of like permanently dies down. And the question is, what was this? The view of the Glastonbury Historical Society, I think, it's pretty incontrovertible, is that some of these are hoaxes. And actually, at the Glastonbury Historical Society, they have like the wooden blocks that were used to make some of the fake Gloacus prints. I think it's the nephew of the guy who did the hoaxes, offered it to the Historical Society. So some of these, especially later on, were hoaxes that were meant to draw in tourists to Glastonbury, basically. But again, initially there are dead livestock. There is stuff that's screaming in the middle of the night. There is some kind of black panther-like creature that's being sought. So it's never not 100% clear exactly what those initial sightings were, those initial creatures were. I think probably not anything supernatural. There's probably some flesh and blood explanations of some kind of exotic or rare or just misidentified creature that wandered in. But it is this kind of lingering mystery. I'll say also growing up in Glastonbury, not really, it's not something you would see a lot of. I think they had a display in the library, in the public library in Glastonbury, for a brief time as like one summer. There was like the Gloacus display, probably in 1999 for the anniversary. I think the Historical Society might have had like a Gloacus shirt on sale. In recent years, I've noticed a kind of an uptick of discussion about this. There's a historian at UMass Amherst, Stephen Gencarella. He just published a few years ago a book of like spooky trails and tales of Connecticut, and he has one chapter on the Gloacus, and he went through, did some scholarly work on kind of like Gloacus reports in newspapers of the time. I believe that's the only kind of like scholarly attention that's really been given to it. There's a few podcasts on cryptids or mythology that have covered it, so it does seem like there's a slow uptick in kind of like the media attention. I think because cryptozoology, cryptids in general, is becoming a much more popular mainstream thing. I think any cryptid is going to get some attention at least. But one thing that is kind of also interesting to me is that the Wikipedia page for the Gloacus is very short. It's very inaccurate. They describe this as originating, I think, in 19th century lumberjack folklore, which is absolutely wrong in every detail. I'm curious what the source for that was. At some point, I'm sure I'll look into that and try and figure it out. But based on that, a lot of the more recent media appearances of the Gloacus are basically just saying it's a lumberjack thing. It's from the 19th century. So you can tell they're just reading the Wikipedia article and kind of building off that, which I think also may have some maybe a cautionary tale in how a lot of paranormal, cryptozoological, certainly beyond cryptozoological notions are mainstreamed, and the lack of fact checking, we can say, that goes into some of this.
Yeah, I see that with puckwudgies too a lot, especially recently. There was some interest around the early 1900s. You see a lot of references in literature, and then there's nothing about it. You see some accounts start popping up in the 90s, but then in the last few years, now you have like people going on podcasts saying are puckwudgies Nephilim, and things like that, and it's gotten a little bit out of control the past couple of years, especially.
The Nephilim are like, they're responsible for everything. They're the ancient aliens, they're demons, they're puckwudgies now. It's I guess they're busy busy entities, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other local cryptids that we have in Connecticut, I think you've done some research on, is the melonheads.
Yes, yeah, that's another interesting, kind of like I would say probably the big homegrown. I guess you can call them cryptid or urban legend, mythological entity. These are focused in southwestern Connecticut, and there's a few different kind of origin stories for them. These are again kind of like diminutive beings with bulbous heads, somewhat like the gray aliens, but none of the stories are that these are aliens. But essentially, these diminutive, kind of hairless, pallid, large-headed creatures that you can find if you're in walking through the woods or certain roads. Like I think in Hamden, there's a Dracula Drive is the name. I did go down there with a friend once and did not see any melon heads there. But again, kind of like these creatures, and there's a few like stories of their origins. I think one story is that these are the descendants of like accused witches in the colonial era that are kind of being driven off, and then kind of like interbreed or like inbreeding, and in the modern day they're the descendants. There are other stories, some like evil doctor was experimenting on children and gave them hydrocephalitis, enlarged heads, and they killed the doctor living in the woods. And base I think those are kind of like the two extremes. And I think certain towns, the melonhead legends that they just want to be left alone, they'll tell you to leave. Others, they're kind of more malicious and are attacking you. And so again, it seems like it's regional, but with town differences amongst them. And I know occasionally there's some other towns. I think is it Fairfield? I think that has like some kind of like like haunted house that's in like a local town legend, and that's supposed to be where the melonheads hang out. And occasionally they'll blink up, cross over with some other like town boogeyman. But it is this interesting phenomenon of specifically Western Connecticut. Although there's also the fact that these are apparently prevalent in Ohio, which, for those who aren't aware, Ohio, before it was the state of Ohio, was the Western Reserve of Connecticut. I have been like very interested in kind of recording like where in Ohio these melonhead legends are, and seeing because certain towns in Ohio are established by settlers that come from certain towns in Connecticut. Very curious to see if there's any kind of like links to the towns in Connecticut with melonheads, because that would seem to be one indication that this is some kind of much longer folklore. I used to be a bigger proponent of this, that this is a mythology that goes back much further, which might elements of it might be, but I think a lot of more in-depth research by me and others, although certainly not entirely definitive, seems to indicate that these legends don't really come up until after World War II. Seem to be some kind of byproduct of suburbanization. I've seen arguments that this might the melonhead, the term might come from Melungeon, which is an Appalachian term essentially for like a mixed race person who was kind of shunned by white society. I'm not really sure how that term would then come to Connecticut, or why you don't have melonheads in Appalachia. Although I guess they probably have equivalents to some degree. But it is interesting that there seems to be possibly some linkage, to some kind of outcasts of some sort, or as I think is the case with a lot of cryptid, especially like arboreal cryptids, we can say that it's some reaction to suburbanization, expansion into wilderness after World War II, and it's kind of nostalgia for a more pastoral lifetime. Before the war, especially the 19th century. But yeah, so that's my interesting ideas about the melonheads.
Yeah, I might actually be able to help you out with the Ohio melonheads. I have a couple of friends that made a documentary about them.
Oh,
They actually had it narrowed. They went to one specific location where there's common sightings. So if you're interested in like specific locations, they could definitely
oh,
help you out.
absolutely, yeah. I would love that. I would definitely be interested in that.
Yeah, it's interesting too how you mentioned that sometimes folklore travels with settlers during that time period. And I've always wondered about that with Pukwudgie specifically, because you had the pilgrims coming here. They technically would not have on the books believed in fae and that type of thing, but there is, the on the books beliefs, and then there's what you actually believe. So I don't think it's impossible that they brought some of those legends over. But New England actually had lots of different groups visiting throughout history, and that left some evidence here, and some things we don't even know who left it here, like Mystery Hill up in New Hampshire, and then Dighton Rock,
Oh yeah, yeah,
your area also.
yeah. It's at Dighton Rock. It's definitely an interesting case study of uh, I guess the way we maybe I don't want not pseudo history. I don't want to say pseudo history, but interpretations of history can change depending on demographics. So if you go back to the colonial, I'll say for those who aren't aware, Dighton Rock. It's a large boulder in the Taunton River. It's actually in currently now it's in the town of Berkeley, which broke off from Dighton, but it's still called Dighton Rock. But it's now a state park, state museum. There's a little museum around it, which is sometimes open, sometimes it's not. There's not really any fixed schedule, so it's kind of frustrating. If you call ahead of time, supposedly they will keep it unlocked for you. Uh, I've had mixed luck on that, but at least I have been inside, so it is occasionally open. But I know it's this large boulder with pictographs on it, and from the 1600s, there's been a lot of settler interest in who left the images, on this rock, on this pictograph, especially because, if you look at there's some symbols that seem like maybe it's a boat with sails. I think my favorite one is there is a smiley face on it. So again, smiley face, a universal symbol apparently. But no, the earliest settlers, in the Pilgrim era in the 1600s, they were very interested in the idea that this was a boulder that had been left by Phoenicians or the lost tribes of Israel. Because again, these are radical Puritans. Their Calvinist, worldview is that the lost tribes were scattered across the world with the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, and that finding evidence of the lost tribes would help bring about this millenarian prophecy, help bring about the second coming. It's not just in New England, in Central Africa, in East Asia. You have a lot of these settlers, explorers in the 15, 16, 1700s, really basically coming across any sign of quote civilization and saying this must have been the lost tribes of Israel. And so there's that initial interest in that period. By the 1800s, it really becomes that that Vikings left this, because that started to be the main interest. In 1837, there's a Danish antiquary. I think he writes a book. It translates into English as Antiquities Americanae, I think. But among other things, this is the idea that, for example, Newport Tower was a Viking tower that comes from that. Here in Fall River, there's the skeleton in armor that's discovered by Lizzie Borden's, or Lizzie Borden's future aunt is the one who discovers it, which also interesting local connection there. But New Englanders in particular had started to look at the Viking Vinland sagas from the Middle Ages, which people had dismissed as just there's a lot of stories, people sailing into the ocean, finding strange islands. In the early 1800s, they start to say maybe this was, New England was what they discovered. And there's some cultural reasons for that too. This is the start of the era of early Catholic emigration to the United States, which has a lot of opposition, especially in New England, a heavily Protestant region. The Vikings, not Christian, but from northern England. And even though it's before there even is a Protestant religion, if you're from northern England, you can kind of be encoded as Protestant. So by saying the Vikings were here first, that's kind of a way to reaffirm that Protestants had been here first. And it also means if the Vikings had first, quote, discovered America, you know, to say Columbus, this Southern European Catholic, was. And so again, kind of a way of moving past that. So the Viking interpretation of Dighton Rock becomes very prominent at the time. Flash forward, you know, to the end of the 19th century, quite a lot of Portuguese settlers start emigrating to this region. Fall River, I think by percentage, is the most Portuguese city in the United States. I think 49% speak Portuguese as their first language. You know, if you come to visit, see Portuguese flags, Cape Verdean flags everywhere, a lot of good food too. But there's a self-educated port or self. He's a dentist, so he's not self, but he's a self-educated historian who, after World War II, comes to Fall River. You know, he becomes absolutely convinced that Dighton Rock had been sent by or had been carved by these lost Portuguese explorers in the early 1500s, and that's indeed the modern State Museum really emphasizes that because again, there's a lot of Portuguese in the region. They lobby the state government to endorse the Portuguese. I think it's Corto Real is the name of the sailor that this is left by his crew, and so therefore, you know, if there's a large, you know, Portuguese voting bloc here, no one really wants to challenge that in the state government, and so you know, you go from Phoenicians to the lost tribes of Israel, reflecting the settler views of the 1600s. You have the Viking interpretation reflecting a lot of these emerging racial and religious politics of the 1800s. The Portuguese interpretation of the 20th century reflecting the Portuguese population. And I know several archaeologists, Kenneth Fader at Central Connecticut State University he's a leading, I think, he's an archaeologist of Native Americans, and he makes a specialty of exploring kind of cases like this. He'll argue, it's very similar to a lot of Wampanoag pictograms you'll find around here. Actually, even just a friend of mine, we went hiking along the Taunton River, last winter. We found a couple Wampanoag pictographs, just on boulders along the river. You can find them here. They are rare, but they're not absent. And this is the only place where you can find pictograms. The most logical interpretation, we'll say, is that it probably is the Wampanoags, the local Native Americans who left this. Now, the problem is the pictograms we have on the boulder today have been touched up over time by well-meaning people. I'm not going to say this is bad, but well-meaning people across time have touched them up because, again, at different interpretations, some of them thought this looks like, like Scandinavian runes. Let's just highlight this. Let's make it so it's easier to read these runes. In the 20th century, a lot of the Portuguese say this looks like a Portuguese galleon. Let's kind of highlight that just to make sure we don't miss that. And if you see photographs, or not even photographs, but inscriptions of Dighton Rock, some of which are like several hundred years old, it looks very different from the pictographs that are there today. So it has changed over the years, which is why a definitive interpretation is probably impossible. It's most likely Wampanoag. Now, that being said, probably not Phoenicians and lost tribes of Israel, but it's not impossible that Vikings came to southern New England. It's not impossible that Portuguese explorers did. I mean, certainly by the mid 1500s, there were Portuguese sailing around here, Verrazano. But again, saying that this is left by those specific people, that requires a standard of evidence that I think is not there currently, we'll say.
Yeah, the same thing happened with the Bellow Falls petroglyphs in Vermont. The smiley faces again, but someone probably well-intentioned went back over them. That's a little bit frustrating. I understand the desire to do that, but still frustrating at the same time. But what do you make of Newport Tower? That's a little bit different than a petroglyph.
Yes, I mean, and it's that's probably the kind of the most famous quote Viking relic, which I say quote it. I would say it's probably not left by Vikings. The most accurate, or the most likely, in my opinion, interpretation of that is a colonial era windmill. If you look at images of windmills from from specifically the parts of England where the settlers from early Rhode Island came. Uh, it looks very similar to Newport Tower. There's mentions of it in the colonial governor Benedict Arnold, who's not the Revolutionary War trader, although he is related to him, but the colonial governor of Rhode Island. Back when Newport was the colonial governor or colonial capital, he mentions his stone-built windmill in his lease, and so again, it seems probably clear that this was the stone-built windmill since this was his property also. So that seems to be the balance of it. But again, uh, there's alternate interpretations. There is a Newport Tower Museum that's right across the road from the Newport Tower. The gentleman who runs that, I'm forgetting his. Actually, I have his book here. Let me just James Allen Egan. His interpretation is that Newport Tower was built by John Dee, the court astrologer, court magician of Elizabeth I. Who is himself? He was the first person to come up with the term British Empire, so he does have some connections there. Mr. Egan and his museum, has this very elaborate theory that the Newport Tower was a camera obscura that was, designed, as kind of like, early observation. I mean, it's not the typical theory, but it's interesting in interpretation. I will say, I was not convinced by his argument. It was built by John Dee. He did convince me that John Dee knew of the location of Newport and probably did intend to establish a settlement here. He pointed out, historical sources where John Dee is talking about the region that is modern day Newport in Rhode Island. And so it does seem that John Dee did intend to establish an English settlement here. That's, on the one hand, that is interesting. I think he deserves some credit for that, but that's also very different from saying that John Dee basically, from afar designed this tower, sent the designs over with English sailors who established this and built this, because that, building those kind of instructions from across the Atlantic Ocean 500 years ago, that is quite the feat. But I do think that the colonial windmill is probably the most accurate one, but certainly the Viking interpretation is still pretty dominant. I mean, there's the Viking Hotel that is right next to the Newport Tower. I think the local sports team are called the Vikings. Just out of curiosity, I asked someone at the Newport Art Museum, just like, but you can see the Newport Tower from there, just being like, what do you make of the Newport Tower? And she was like, oh, I don't really think about it. Wasn't that supposed to be like a Viking church or something like that? So it does seem that it's, kind of a general sense of, the Viking ancestry. But again, it's coming from this cultural context of the 1830s when there is this need to reaffirm, the Northern European Protestant nature of America at the first time that's being significantly challenged by not just, mainly Irish and German at the time, which again, today we would consider white, but at the time were not considered white or European. And French Canadians a few years after that, which again is a major site for French Canadians, and then Polish, Portuguese, and so again, the New Englanders like to imagine themselves as modern day Vikings, which also seems kind of strange to us. But again, the idea, medieval Greenland, Norway, Iceland, this very hard scrabble, very austere lifestyle that kind of fit in with the Congregationalist view of themselves. And it's worth noting that in Iceland, at least, this is one of the very first modern republics. The Althing was a democratic-ish legislature, and so again, there's an effort to combine the town hall spirit of New England with the Norse legislature of Iceland, and kind of draw that symbolic link to republicanism.
Yeah, I think something similar happened with Guimont down in Groton too. People very much want that to have some kind of Celtic origin. And I do think it's because most of the people here are of Celtic origin.
Yeah.
I have never understood why, the same thing with Dighton Rock and Mystery Hill. I've never understood why there's the refusal to admit it's probably just indigenous.
Yeah,
I've even heard
it's
someone say, there's evidence that there was a sheep farm here. Why are we even talking about this? Well, it was a continuously inhabited site. There's going to be evidence of other things there also.
I mean, this reflects, the sense I think that, like Native American, Indigenous, American, just like, if you go to Africa, but technically, I did my dissertation on African history. It seems a very long way away, but it's the same with African cultures when Europeans arrive. If you're not building cities, if you don't have a literate, written, based transmission of knowledge, you're not really considered, real civilization. And I mean, it's even, I think in recent years, you've seen things like, the city of Cahokia. You've seen a lot of the native mounds in the Midwest kind of get a bit more recognition, a bit more interest. But again, it is a shame that so much indigenous history is not remembered, not seen as exciting as Europeans. I mean, for some reason, like if you have like Vikings sailing across the ocean, encountering the Americas, that's exciting. Uh, you know Native Americans, traveling across, visiting here from different parts of the country. There's evidence that trade networks linked New England to, the Southwest, Central America. I mean, not directly, but that's very interesting. I mean, in my view, that you can have, like uh, uh, what's jade or from Central America, or aquamarine from the Southwest wind up here in jewelry. That's a very I think that's just as interesting to me as Vikings sailing across the Atlantic. And again, there's also the fact that there is some evidence that Native Americans sailed across to Europe, and you don't really hear that. You hear about that much less than you hear about the opposite, even when most of the opposite is of questionable historicity to some extent. But the idea that some Native Americans may have sailed to Ireland, may have sailed to uh, Norway. There's fairly strong evidence for that as far back as Roman times, even. Again, that's not really as well known. The same with, for example, I think on the other side of the continent, Polynesian navigation, which I think is starting to get maybe a bit more recognition. That there's been multiple contacts between kind of ancient Asian and Polynesian cultures and uh, the west coast of the Americas. The fact that the Polynesians navigate across the Pacific Ocean, using just memorization of star maps, that it seems like possibly Polynesians were the first to sail to Antarctica over 1,000 years before Europeans knew Antarctica existed. I think that's all very interesting, but again, unfortunately, it's not as sexy as Vikings or Phoenicians or people from the quote old world coming to North America.
Yeah, a while back. So, growing up, you're told that people came to North America over the land bridge. And then, recently there's been more conversation about, well, maybe that doesn't all add up. There's some evidence of humans being here before there was a land bridge. Um, I made the mistake of trying to Google that recently, and what a mess.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's like again, and I want to be careful. This is far afield from my specialty, but I have dabbled in this because it's such a prominent topic. But yeah, the idea that used to be, say, used to decades ago, was the idea of the Clovis first hypothesis, which argued that people came over the Bering Land Bridge first. That that was the only way that people came in waves. That this certain culture was the first culture. Over the in the decades since, that's increasingly been challenged. That there are now kind of like pre-Clovis artifacts that the settlement of the coast may have happened, or almost certainly did happen, much faster than inland. Today, you'll have we'll say people with certain agendas saying like, oh, Clovis first is impossible, therefore the entire basis for the idea that Native Americans came here, so that's completely thrown out. They challenge the idea of that they challenge the history of native settlement of the Americas based on how it was, in the 1960s, probably when a lot of them were in school. They don't recognize that, scholarship has changed. And so any, supposed out of place artifact they then use to challenge, all of archaeology. And I think some, not all, I want to be clear, not all, but I think there are some who are do this for particularly nefarious reasons. I don't know if you've come across this. There's the Solutrean hypothesis, as it's called, which argues, just as there was the Bering Land Bridge during the Ice Age connecting Siberia and Alaska, this is the idea that there's kind of like a frozen land bridge across the North Atlantic, and ancient Europeans migrated across the Solutrean ice bridge, as it's termed, and this is an idea that's popular among a quote certain online crowd because it means that Europeans were the quote real Native Americans, that the people we associate with Paleo Indians migrating out of Siberia massacred and killed off the original quote white settlers of the America, and that therefore as a result the conquest of the Americas by Europeans, the genocide of the Native Americans, this is justified because they did it to quote us as in ancient Europeans tens of thousands of years ago. Just to be clear, there is absolutely no evidence for that at all. But you'll find this very commonly repeated. Even in we'll say like more politically active right wing websites that otherwise have no interest in ancient history and Paleo Indian settlement theories, but are very committed to the idea of this Solutrean land bridge. It's kind of much like the New Englanders of the 1800s were very interested in the Viking theory. It's essentially a similar reason why modern right wing people are very interested in the Solutrean idea.
Yeah, I recently started looking into the legend of the moon-eyed people. It's a Cherokee
Mm,
legend. Are you familiar with it?
yes, yeah.
And people will try to turn that into a narrative of white people being here, and it's almost it's disheartening. It's a little bit disgusting at times the way some people try to take history and rewrite it and make it fit their narrative.
I mean, it's a sign that like you hear the attack today that history is too political, or people with agendas are right. It's as if that's never been the case. Again, it's it, as I tell students, when historians are people. I think no reputable historian will say, yeah, you can be objective, because no human is objective, no AI is objective either. As a lot of the recent AI debates have shown, AIs are programmed by humans that have just the same biases as their creators. So unless an angel descends from heaven that is without sin or something like that, no history that's written by any thinking being is going to be free of bias. Some are hopefully more objective than others, but the idea that it's only like crazy Marxist university professors who've started to pervert history. Just read any of the views of history. For example, in the 1800s or the 1900s, and you'll see some definitely interesting interpretations with clearly political agendas back then.
Yeah, my family history also. So my mother's a Hinckley. Governor Thomas Hinckley is my ninth grade uncle. And, growing up, I was told, he was a great guy. He was the last governor of Plymouth Colony and all this. When I started researching Pukwudgies, I had to look into King Philip's War.
Mm-hmm.
His name started coming up, and it was not flattering. And so I had this ancestor who I was told growing up was a great guy, and then I found out his thought process was that the great dying was because God killed everyone here because they were meant to live here. And then he basically he was not the only one, but he was a driver of a genocide, really. So, I mean, it's funny how you grow up with one narrative and then you start digging and you find out it's not anything like what you thought. And my family does not like when I talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that like God knows prepared this land for us. I mean, I think that's a deeply ingrained, not just in the U.S. I mean, it's Canada, Australia. It's, I think, anywhere there's a settler colony, you're going to find uh, ideas like this. I mean, it's, I think it makes sense in a certain point of view. Like if God has prepared it for you, you can't really challenge God, and it's therefore very easy. And yeah, again, so I'm not just bashing religion. Science also is ideas of scientific evolution. The idea that you could take Darwin's theory of evolution and apply it to the different human races or human cultures. Something that Darwin himself was definitely did not believe in that, but others use that, including some of his own friends. But the idea that okay, Native Americans are this supposed dying race because again, it's just the law of natural selection. So it's not that God has cleared them all off and taken them up to heaven. It's just the scientific laws of survival of the fittest just means it's the way things work. And even though if you read a lot of like Bureau of Indian Affairs documents from the late 19th century, there was this large sentiment. It was just an assumption that Native Americans will go extinct. That's not out of question. Maybe a few of them can kind of be elevated to basically become white in culture, if not in not in blood, I guess. I didn't have genes or knowledge of it then, but it was essentially like, okay, our job is based, to be like, hospice workers for the Native Americans. So set them on reservations where they can, peacefully die off, and then we don't have to think about them anymore. And I think it's something I think is still in a lot of the background, of a lot of people today, even not intentionally maybe, but I think it is difficult, to think like, oh, it's the reason we're here in North America is you have to kind of think about like, oh, it's just how widespread the population was before settlers arrived, and why we were able to migrate west. And I mean even then, I think the idea of the pastoral native, like the native who lived in harmony with nature. I think even that's kind of a sense of okay, the Native American is or quote the Native American is not a culture and it doesn't have its own history. It's part of nature. I mean, I think even until fairly recently in the Smithsonian, I think a lot of Native American artifacts and like Polynesian artifacts too are in the natural history part, as if they're part of nature. They're not part of human history or human culture. And the reality is Native Americans impacted their environment. I mean, part of the reason why you can see in like records of ice cores that the Native American genocide led to a global cooling because Native Americans were cutting down trees, they had fires, they were impacting the environment. When they're all when many of them are being killed off, they're stopping impacting the environment. So I think even the idea, the probably well-meaning idea of the noble savage who lived in concert with nature, and it was kind of like an ideal for the environmentalist movement in the 1970s. That's also fairly ahistorical. That's a way of dealing with the fact that you don't have to think of the Native American as a human. Just it's part of nature. It's not a branch of human history and human culture.
Yeah. And so there was one colonial New Englander that has not been ruined for me yet. You might tell me otherwise, but he seems to have had a positive attitude towards Native Americans even, and he hated my ancestors, so I immediately like him. But Roger Williams,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's the founder of Rhode Island, founder of Providence. I think there's a few examples of these. In the 1700s, I think William Penn comes across relative. I say relatively. I don't think entirely, but relatively well compared with other treatment of Native Americans, and also with religious differences as well amongst the settlers. And I know it. I tell this to my students too. It's worth pointing out there are people, the idea that slavery was universally accepted is not true. The idea that settlement of the Americas was seen as a good thing, that was not. There are critics in the past. Famously in kind of the Spanish colonial context, it's Bartolome de las Casas who wrote on the destruction of the Indies, and again, he did think that the goal was to convert Native Americans to Christianity, but to kind of do it through kindness, through respecting their culture instead of just killing them off wantonly. So there are people in the past, maybe not as much as today, but there are people in the past who were critics, did see Native Americans and Africans as humans, as fully humans, did condemn colonialism, did condemn slavery, and we can see that there's a bit more recognition of that. But I think that also kind of fuels, I think, kind of on both sides of the political divide. You can see conservatives who would like to say everyone in the past was just terrible, so who cares who killed who. And also now that we have any kind of recognition of this now, that's an inherent sign that we've done so much we don't have to do anything else. And I think there's also some a section of liberals who I think either want to view themselves as a kind of the end point of progress, and so if you have any positives in the past, that impacts their view of their own development. But also I think so a lot of scourging of themselves also, and don't want to recognize anything or anyone good in the past. So I think on both sides of the political divide, at least kind of in the modern culture wars, there's a reluctance to address this. And again, it's not like these people were dominant in the past, but they were there occasionally. I think it's worth keeping that in mind as well, that even people in the past did recognize that some of this stuff was pretty messed up, so to speak. And there's also, I think, maybe coming back a bit to the more, not necessarily cryptozoological, but mythological, there's an increasing, I think, understanding that, people have, long talked about trade with Native Americans, with, Mesoamericans, with the Caribbean peoples. But I think there's been a bit more study recently of ideas that have come from Native Americans, especially, for example, from the Iroquois, ideas of a democracy, representative government, constitutionalism that impacted a lot of the colonial settlers, especially in the decades leading up to the American Revolution. Very recently, there's been some historical work arguing that some of the ideas of, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, were coming from people like Benjamin Franklin, who were very interested in Iroquois political notions in the decades before the American Revolution. Simultaneously, there's a historian of science, Adrienne Mayer, and others have as well. She's kind of the main name behind this, but who have looked at how, not just Native Americans, but enslaved Africans in the early colonies have applied their knowledge of fossils, of life, to early paleontology, and identifying early fossils. Like the very first mastodon remains in the United States were discovered by enslaved Africans from the Congo, who not only physically uncovered the remains of the mastodon, but identified them because they knew what elephant remains looked like. And so you can argue paleontology as a science in the Americas comes from Native Americans and Africans much more than Europeans. And in the Midwest, I'll be quiet after this, but in the Midwest also, there's a creature amongst kind of like the plains, and it's a mythological beast, the Unteki, the water monster. The original depiction of the water monster from when these tribes lived around the Great Lakes was very clearly based on an aquatic mammal. When these tribes are then forcibly relocated to the Badlands of South Dakota, an area with a lot of fossilized prehistoric animals, the description of the Unteki changes to reflect the fossils, the mosasaur. So you get something that's originally like a water buffalo and starts to get described as like a dinosaur, basically. And again, this is because they're seeing the fossil remains. They're deciding that, you can see fossilized flippers from the mosasaur. they said this is an actual like ancient water monster. They then change their mythological creature. They have the mythology of this water monster. They see the actual remains. Say, oh, this must actually be what the Unteki looks like. By analyzing remains of the past, they're applying it to their own histories, and so you get this change of this mythological creature through early scientific method, we can say.
Yeah. I point out I have my stegodon bone necklace on right now.
Very good.
So, what advice would you give someone that wants to look into either folklore, local history? You know, we talked briefly about my frustration just looking into the history of these stone sites in the area. So, what advice would you give someone that wants to find out the real facts behind these things in history?
I would say if you're interested in local story, again, I'll promote the local historical societies. I think that's a good place, just to start to see what people in the past have thought of some of these stories, some of these mythologies. I would say, particularly with stone sites, with things like, fossils or cryptozoology. Again, I'll bring up Kenneth Fader's books. He in particular has one called, I'm hoping I'm going to remember the title right, Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries, which is basically, a good primary, it's kind of like a good source for the aspiring not just archaeologists, paleontologists, cryptozoologists, of how to think about some of these myths, think about like how to analyze and interrogate stories, has a lot of case studies. I think he's done kind of a really good job creating, literally the textbook for understanding a lot of these. Some other names that I'll just kind of throw out. Andrew Kinkella's podcast, Pseudo Archaeology. Jeb Card has a number of podcasts and books that explore this. One of his books is called Spooky Archaeology. Definitely recommend that. Sharon Hill has a book called Scientifical Americans, which again is about how to understand the scientific method and how it's used and misused by kind of paranormal researchers. I think these are all fairly easy to read books. I think they're good kind of introductory levels for people interested in historical analyses of some of these myths and legends of the past.
Excellent. Speaking of books, you have some.
Yes.
If somebody is interested in them, what are their names? What are they about? Where can they find them?
So my first book that's out with Horace Smith, your past guest, it's called When the Stars Are Right, H.P. Lovecraft and Astronomy, available from Hippocampus Press. It looks at, the Providence, Rhode Island author H.P. Lovecraft, the creator of Cthulhu, among many other things. It specifically looks at a lot of his interest in astronomy and how it impacts his life and his fiction. But I think that's also useful because we use it to look at kind of like a case study of several evolving notions of astronomical science. So, we talk about evolving notions of life on Mars and the moon, during Lovecraft's lifetime. We talk about a lot of the early UFO sightings from the 19th century, about changing ideas of cosmology, like, the ether. I think we talk about the hollow earth a little bit. So even if, you only have kind of a vague knowledge of Lovecraft, this is a good book for looking at how ideas about astronomy and humanity's relationship to it changes, from the late 19th into the early 20th centuries. My second book, which I'm hoping should be done and submitted to the publisher by the end of this year, it's called The Power of the Flat Earth Idea. It's going to be published by Palgrave Macmillan. This is kind of like a political history of flat earthers. And again, relevant to our discussion, one of the main focuses, kind of one of the main quote characters in my book is a former slave in Virginia after the end of the Civil War named John Jasper, who was a Baptist preacher, but also a very prominent flat earther. I talk to some degree about how his ideas of the flat earth come from basically a liberation theology interpretation of the Old Testament. So kind of the same religious sources he's looking at to justify and support Black emancipation during the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras. These are interpretations that are leading him to think the Earth is flat. So again, kind of like a liberation interpretation of flat Earth theology, which again, not to pat myself on the back, I haven't really seen this done before, so I think it will make an interesting reveal in the field. And I do talk a bit about where flat Earth ideas overlap with other notions, a lot of UFO and modern conspiracy stuff near the end. So again, if you're interested in kind of wider conspiracy or pseudoscience, that could be a book of interest. And outside of that, I have a number of articles, some of which are online. You can find, if you Google Edward Guimont, some of these will come up. Have some works on cryptozoology that are free to read online. Some of my works on UFOs, and specifically UFOs and New England folklore, which maybe if I come on again, I can talk about ideas, UFOs and puckwudgies and melon heads. I feel like there may be some kind of a unifying theory between these. So maybe that's a little hook for me to come back next time. But again, Google my name and you'll definitely find some interesting stuff to read.
I'm definitely hooked because I have seen some commonalities there and connections as well. So I'm interested to see if they're the same as what you found.
Well, can't wait to talk about it someday.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. This has been a blast. I don't think I got through half of the list of things. Definitely have to have you back on.
Anytime. I'm happy to talk.
All right, great. And thanks everyone for watching and have a good night.
Goodbye.